Thank you, Alex, for the nice introduction.
We love
How are
having
you?
you here. We love having you here, GeePaw.
Oh, great. Thank you very much.
Go ahead.
Um, Hi. Good morning. Welcome to the conference. Good afternoon. Welcome to the conference. Good evening. Good night. Welcome to the conference. My name is GeePaw Hill, and I know that's kind of a strange name. It's GeePaw. It's a nickname for grandfather. And now, I'm a bitter old man, so naturally I look like a grandfather. But I actually got that name, wow, 31 years ago, when I was presented at a very young age with my very first grandchild. And of course, that's a really young age to be a grandpa. And my friends and family thought that was hilarious. So they called me that at every opportunity. And when I put myself out in the world and started talking to people, I just started calling myself GPaw. So now you know the backstory on that name. Today, I'm going to start by the conference by talking both um, about TDD and about something bigger than test driven development. And I'm going to frame this in the form of what I call garlic and rice advice. I had a friend at the start of the pandemic that, she had been a professional chef for something like 35 years. And, professional chefs in quarantine, they don't have a whole lot to do. So she'd done all the Netflix binging that she could imagine pulling off. And she had read all the books that she was going to read. And so she wanted something to do. So she decided to write the ultimate beginner's cookbook. And she was going to do it live on Twitter. And I'm sitting here and I'm waiting for this. I'm waiting for this to start churning out of her all this stuff. And she had one tweet, and it had 2 points in it. Point number one, that's too much rice. And point number two, mm, that's not enough garlic. And I thought to myself, well, come on. You think about that. Of course, I laughed. You think about that and you're like, well, geez, actually, that's pretty good advice, especially for people who are just getting into cooking. Because the first thing you do when you're a starter cook is you cook a humongous amount of rice because rice swells up. And then you take one little teeny tiny bit of garlic and you try to flavor it. And it doesn't work because garlic is a lot weaker once it's cooked than when it's sitting there in your hands. And I thought to myself, well, what is my rice and garlic advice? What advice could I give blind to just about anybody in just about any situation? And that advice is this: take many more, much smaller steps. If you want to get there faster, if you want to get to value faster, if you want to get to change faster, if you want to change code faster, take many more, much smaller steps. So, unwind. You just heard my case. There's my case. I'm going to map it out in a little more detail, but let's go backwards. If you go and study the software development, design methodologies and everything from the old days, from 80s, from 90s, kicking it old school, what you're going to find is that they have lots and lots of demonstration projects. And all of these projects have three things in common. They have small scope. They are really ridiculously tiny compared to the applications that we write today. The typical one would be a point of sale system for a, are you ready for this? A videotape rental store. That would be the typical sort of app that you would see in these old school design documents. Now, the next thing that would be true of all of them is that they all had single threaded construction. There was one person, maybe three people in a small team, and they are the ones who wrote all the software from beginning to end. And the third thing that was true of all of them is that the target itself, the end point of sale video rental system, was fixed and final. It was defined at the beginning We do it, and then it's defined for all time going forward. So I tease those books because basically they elaborated an extremely detailed software development process consisting of 3 steps: nothing, everything, move on. And the thing is, of course, I'm making a joke, right? And these people helped me so much in my career. They helped me get so strong at a certain kind of software development. And I'm teasing them when I say that, but that's really how it felt compared to what we do now, which is work on gigantic apps with substantial multiple teams to a constant rhythm of change happening inside that application at all times. So when somebody gives me a problem, almost before the second sentence is out, I'm breaking it up into its pieces. I'm solving the puzzle. I'm solving the problem. Baby, it's a geek thing, all right? It's what I do, okay? I break puzzles into parts. That's how I work. And that idea is fundamental to what we do for a living, but it's also really deep in those 80s old school design approaches. And they look like this. As they have morphed up to our current day, we decompose the problem up front into its separate final parts. We then divvy it up amongst the teams, or if we're in a team, amongst the individuals. We're going to finish each part to its final state, and then we're going to put them all together, and then we're going to move on. We're going to go to a separate project, something else. It's going to be done. It's done. It's done. Forget about it. And this hybrid approach graphically looks kind of like this. This is the sort of popular idea that you will see of how software should be developed at companies that are very small, but also at companies that are classic high-end enterprises. It looks like this. We're going to invest a whole bunch of value because we've got to pay people to do this stuff. We're going to determine the target by writing everything we know about the target down. We're going to let geeks like me break it up into its final finished pieces. Then we're going to divvy those pieces up into multiple streams that will come running towards this grand finale, at which time we will assemble all the final parts, and then we will receive the value, hopefully more value than we put into this thing in the first place. That is the sort of modern version of that 80s take. And unfortunately, it doesn't work very well. So I'm here to introduce you to this idea, and it's very relevant to TDD, but as I say, relevant to more than just TDD. Stride limited activated steps. You're looking out and trying to decide what to do. And my proposal is that you do this. You write down the possible steps you could take away from here. You scratch off any of the steps whose endpoint you could not ship. Then you scratch off any of the steps that would be longer than the amount of time that we've set for this particular activity. I'll tell you about that in a little more detail a little bit later. And then finally, you scratch off all the steps that would actually result in negative user value. Now, the user value doesn't have to go up, but it has to at least stay the same. So that's what I mean when I say stride limited activated steps. Again, going with a picture of it, this is a picture of a single step. We sink a little bit of cost. We're at a state where we are active right now. Why do I say that? Because most of us, most of the time, are already shipping. We are already, this trade in the 40 years since 1980, this trade has gone from almost no brownfield development to almost continuous 90% brownfield development. We do not get a blank page in this trade anymore. The trade is already full of a working app. So we start from a place of actually being activated most of the time. A single step then is the gap in time between the time we are activated that it creates benefit for us. And what I'm proposing is that we absolutely fix the maximum duration of that gap. In fact, above all other considerations about the gap. In other words, if the steps we're talking about are the space between two tests in a test-driven development environment, if we're coding, I'm proposing we fix that maximum duration to something well under an hour. Now, obviously, it varies depending upon my environment, but working in Kotlin, the absolute maximum that I would wait between steps, that I would be willing to sit between steps, is about half an hour. Most of the steps I take when I am test driving code in Kotlin and developing new stuff are actually more like 10 minutes, 15 minutes. I'm talking about a ridiculously small step. I used to just come on screen and say blankly to everybody, no, smaller, yeah, smaller. I started TDD 20 years ago. And if you asked me, what is the one thing that test-driven development, what is the hardest thing to learn and what is the most important thing that you learned in your 20 years of test-driven development? And it would be, no, smaller. Take smaller steps. Now, what's this going to produce? Instead of that thing with the three things and the team and the thing, it's going to produce something that looks like this. And I know that when you see this, your head is not going to instantly say that's the most efficient path. Nevertheless, that is my case, and I'm going to give it to you in some detail now. The most efficient path is to make each one of those steps you see rambling across that screen, however lazy looking you think they are, the same size or smaller, to limit the size of your steps, even if it means you're going to have to take more of them, even if it means you're going to have to take steps that don't produce direct user value, even if it means you're going to have to take steps that are off the path of the perfect straight line towards your system. Now, the walking skeleton part over here on the side, walking skeleton is a term by Alistair Coburn, and what it means is essentially we start by modern architectures almost always have layers wrapped around a core, and what we want to do when we make a walking skeleton is do the crudest, simplest thing that is one single pathway from pixels to bits, from bits back out to pixels, that touches every one of those layers, the center of that layer. That's what that walking skeleton concept is. Now, of course, if you're already in brownfield, there is no walking skeleton. You have a working app, and the walking skeleton is the working app. So you can sort of smoosh that aside if you're already spending all your time working on apps that have already shipped. But as soon as I get a walking skeleton, I can start doing stride limited activated steps, and I can bring myself onto this most efficient path. Now, so notice these circles. It might be a little hard to see on your screen, but all of these guys have a red ball, a red circle at the beginning. That represents the cost of that. Some of them have a green at their end, like this very first one. But you'll notice that some of them don't. That green is the extrinsic value. It is the value of whatever you got done being given to you. It's optional. Remember, I said I pick steps. I don't have to pick steps that are only going to improve the user's experience. And improving the user's experience is, of course, how we make money. We are allowed to take steps that don't improve it. We're just not allowed to take steps that make it worse. All right. So if they don't improve it, you're not going to get a green circle. And then there's this blue circle, and the blue circle is the intrinsic benefit that comes just because you finished a step, not for any other reason, not because of what that step was, but because it's in fact a step that you were taking. Here's the case in detail. Looking over at my time here, making sure I'm good to go. The case in detail is this. Although that funky looking picture seems like it would be inefficient, a large part of the reasoning that you're using to decide that is coming out of your belief that software is actually plain geometry. It isn't. Software isn't plain geometry. Step 2, the directed parallelization, the central intelligence that is doing the splitting up of the tasks and the integrating them at the end. Directed parallelization is what we call NP hard. I'll explain what that means when we get there. Third thing I've already touched upon, steps have intrinsic value. They have value above and beyond the question of whether or not they actually improve the user's experience. And the fourth point, we're going to spend a lot of time on each of these actually. The fourth point is that changeability actually costs less than rework avoidance. What do I mean rework avoidance? Remember when we said we had that puzzle part? And we had the puzzle and we broke it up into its final parts. Final is a really important word there. The reason we break it up into final parts is because we don't want to change anything we already changed. We want to avoid rework. And avoiding rework is, in fact, the entire essence. It's the centerpiece of that weird three-limbed thing that is, unfortunately, the most common way that software is built and developed in the world today. The fourth plank here is that changeability actually costs less than rework avoidance cost. All right, let's take them one at a time. First of all, everybody knows the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. And yet my line that I've drawn on this screen is not straight. It's not a straight line. What the hell, GeePaw? The only place where the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line is on a two-dimensional featureless plane. Now, you know this. You just don't think of it because you've sort of fallen into the trap of reasoning from a hyper simple abstraction, the beautiful, smooth plane, into thinking that that applies to the real world, but you actually know it applies to the real world. I'm not going to show you the brand name here. I'm sure you can guess, but I like soda and I drink it all the time as a comfort thing. And the nearest place at which I can buy a 6-pack of these is about 1.5 miles that way. I'm out on my deck. I can't see it, but it's about 1.5 miles that way. Think about the nearest place that you could get a soda if we were in the same place. I was your guest and you, oh my God, I got to get sodas for this guy. He's obsessed with soda. Draw a straight line to it. Is anybody here going to walk a straight line to that? Are you kidding me? The first thing I would do, I would fall off this 2nd-story deck down to the earth. Then about 10 meters away, I would descend a ravine that is about 25 meters deep, which I would then have to climb back up. Of course, I couldn't climb back up it very easily because my clothes would be soaking wet because I would have swum across a river in order to pursue the shortest distance between 2 points. The surface has obstacles. But here's the thing, that's not all. Act before midnight tonight, and you get not only the surface having obstacles that you have to go around and maneuver in order to get to the point fastest, but the vehicle you're in is changing as you drive it. The vehicle self-modifies. Because, what vehicle am I talking about? Oh, the software. The software is changing as you approach wherever it is you're going. Every step, in fact, changes the software. So the vehicle that we're actually using to get to this destination is undergoing modification while you are driving it. But wait, act before midnight tonight, and you get not only the surface obstacles and not only the self-modifying vehicle, you also get the fact that both the target and the obstacles move. In this way, we've finally stepped away from the concept of a plane. We stepped away once towards the concept of the actual terrain around us, but we stepped away again. Now we're off into really weird space because the terrain between me and Ashley's market, Central Virginia, stop by anytime. The distance between me and Ashley's market, straight line or not, the terrain doesn't change fast enough to matter to me, right? It doesn't suddenly, the river doesn't suddenly go away and then suddenly come back. Neither does the ravine. This second story deck on which I'm sitting right now has been a second story deck its entire lifetime and probably will be until the day everything falls apart. The terrain doesn't actually change, and the obstacles don't actually move in real life terrain. In software, they do constantly. The terrain changes because of new tech. It changes because of new technicians. And the target, no matter how much we thought to ourselves that we understood that finished, polished, complete, perfect jigsaw puzzle, that's got nothing to do with actual software. Not only is that not the target, really, but that target itself is constantly moving. Now, you know this. Have you ever had a marketing or salesperson come to your team and say, you know what? I know I told you our most important thing was to do X, but if you could do Y in 3 weeks, I can close a $300 million deal for the company. Anybody who's been in software long enough has experienced the target changing dramatically. Sometimes, honestly, sometimes with a day notice. So that's why plain geometry just doesn't capture the reality of software development. The surface has obstacles on it. The vehicle self-modifies, and both the targets and the target and the obstacles move around on us. Now, that means that the sort of detailed, meticulous planning that we would have to have that final puzzle put together, it isn't just hard, it's impossible. It cannot be done. You can't throw more thinking at it. You can't throw more money at it. It's not possible. Second point, directed parallelism doesn't scale. What? We have these 3 streams. And what we're doing is we have a central intelligence. It could be a single person or it could be a small group, whatever, that is directing those 3 parallel processes. That's expensive, even a little bit. But the problem is the expense goes up radically with the number of parts that are in play, the number of entities. We have an extraordinarily strong tendency to think of the work in front of us as being like laying bricks. Now, if it takes you 10 minutes to lay 10 bricks, it is reasonable to expect that it will take you 500 minutes to lay 500 bricks. That's the blue line. We can describe problems we can describe the effort we need to solve a problem by relating it to the number of entities in that problem. That is true of nearly every problem. And there are different kinds of problem out there. There are problems where that relationship, if we express it as a function, there are problems where that relationship is a polynomial, where if you drew the curve, it would be a straight line like that nice blue, or something slightly off the straight line. If there are economies of scale, it's a very common concept from capitalism, it isn't a straight line. A line actually declines. It doesn't permanently decline, but it declines. Once you get to 1,000 bricks, it's all the same deal, right? And that's essentially what economies of scale represent. But there's still another kind of problem. All of these problems that can be expressed the way we've talked so far are polynomial on n. NP problems are non-polynomial on n. And what that means is that the relationship between n and the actual effort you have to put into the game takes a curve kind of like this red curve here. Juggling bricks. We're not laying bricks anymore, we're juggling them. I'll come back to that in a second. So what are we saying here? What I'm saying is, of course, the problem gets harder when you make the problem bigger. So bigger number on the input, bigger on the effort. NP problems don't just get bigger on the input to bigger on the effort. They get bigger on the effort. Now, I know that not all of you are computer scientists, but I know some of you are computer scientists, and you know I just gave you a very loosey-goosey description of the concept of non-polynomial problems. An NP hard problem is a problem that has a curve like this red one that can be broken up into smaller problems, each of which has a curve like that red one. In other words, NP hard is harder than what you probably mostly learned in school, which was NP complete. Okay. Directed parallelism is this business of managing your 27 teams working on one application. And what we're saying here is that that problem is NP complete. It works fine when the N is 2 teams. It works okay when it's 5 teams. It becomes impossible when there are 20 teams. I'm just guessing at those numbers. I think they're actually probably a little smaller in real life. I think the best way to understand it is that, as I said, the difference between laying bricks and juggling bricks. If it takes you 1 minute to do 1 brick, it takes you 10 minutes to do 10 bricks. But bump, as long as you're laying them. No one in the history of ever has ever successfully juggled, anybody? 12 bricks or 12 anything. The world record for juggling, and it's disputed. There are 2 people. One claims to have done it and has witnesses. One did it on video. There are 2 people in the world who have ever juggled 11 things at one time. Just 2. Juggling bricks is an NP hard problem. It's got a curve that looks like that red curve on my screen, not a curve that looks like that blue. And what I'm saying is that directed parallelism, a central intelligence managing all of this, is also an NP hard problem. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. You can look around. How many meetings you been in this week? This week, were you in a bunch of meetings? Were they planning meetings? Were they scrum meetings? Were they stand-up meetings? Did you use Jira? Did they take a lot of time? Managing directed parallelism is extremely expensive and extremely difficult. What about your last 5 deployments? Were they press a button, ship that bad boy? Or were they spend an hour, stress. Oh, brush fire, put it out. Oh, brush fire, put it out. Oh, brush fire, put it out. The reason is because they are the product of directed parallelism. They're the product of individuals or small teams who are cherry picking changes to a system in order to get it to the deployment stage. Directed parallelism does not scale. And that's the second plank of my case in favor of many more much smaller steps. Now, my third one, boring slide, sorry, didn't have time. Steps have intrinsic benefit. Steps are good in and of themselves, especially if we're talking about systems that involve humans. All those little steps jiggity-jaggedying across your screen, every single one of them offers reversibility and steerability and interruptibility. I'm going to put those three first, and I'm going to kind of clump them all together. Do you ever see that, or do you ever hear, I'm sure you have, you might have even said it yourself from time to time, if you interrupt me, I have to start over. I can't talk to you right now. And you know what? You might even use the juggling metaphor. I can't talk to you right now. I'm juggling 9 things. And if you give me a 10th thing, I'm going to blow it. And I'm going to have to drop all the balls. I'm going to have to start all over again. God, why are you constantly interrupting me? The reason that is so is because you are between 2 states of availability, of shippability, of completeness. Between those 2 states, you can't be interrupted. Not by your boss, not by your colleague, not by your kid, not by your dog. You can't be interrupted. If you're interrupted, you have to start all over again. But if you're at one of those arrows where you have actually applied, you've actually put the change out to the world, then cool. Let me go help you. Let me go help you with that toy. Let me go help you with this meeting. Let me go help you here or there or the other place. That is interruptibility. But it isn't just interruptibility. There's also steerability, because here's the thing. Same thing exactly. If I'm in the middle of a step, I can't steer. I can't change direction. I have to finish that step. Now, if I finish the step, I'm interruptible and I can steer. I can go in some different direction than what I was planning to go on after that. But if I'm in the middle of that step, I can't. So interruptibility and steerability are kind of the same thing. We can't get the one unless we also have the other. And steerability is a huge value. And of course, personally, as individuals, interruptibility is also a huge value. What about reversibility? Well, these are small steps. And one of the big differences between taking many more much smaller steps and taking these great big gigantic strides is this. It's okay to be wrong. You can take a small step, look at it and say, yeah, no, I don't really like that. Let's take it back. If you're coding, and we started this conversation by talking strictly about coding, what does it cost you? Remember, I already timed it. I said it's going to cost you somewhere significantly less than an hour. Taking it all back is no big deal. Git reset -- hard. It's no big deal. I know. If a lot of people think the programming is typing. Programming isn't typing. Programming is thinking. And when you throw away your code, you're not throwing away your thinking, you're throwing away your typing. Reversibility means that our small steps can go forwards and then they can go backwards. And they can go off at this sort of angle and then right back down to that sort of angle when you realize you headed in the wrong direction. So there's 2 ways in which we can effectively do reversals when we have taken small enough steps. What about grokability? Grok, I'm hoping everybody here is comfortable with that term. It comes from Robert A. Heinlein, Stranger in a Strange Land. Grok means to understand instantly and intuitively and correctly and perfectly. Okay, but we use it casually to say, I get it. I see what's going on here. I grok this situation. So grokability is our ability to hold the whole step in our head at one time. It is, in fact, another kind of juggling. The in terms of step size, is always about how many things do I have in play. In code, it's typically how many small elements of the code do I have to line up before I'm available, before I've shipped, before I've actually applied the change that I wanted to apply. When that in gets big, we're right back at that juggling. We're right back at that juggling curve again. We have hit an NP difficult problem. Only this time, the problem isn't a mathematical theory problem. It's actually a problem of psychology. 1954, George Miller proposed that based on the research his grad students were doing, he proposed that the limits on human bandwidth were, this is a famous number, you might have heard of it, 7 plus or minus 2, somewhere between 5 and 9 things. And since then, that proposition has been tested 1,000 times by grad students all over the planet. I mean, 1954 was a long time ago. And here is the thing. The modern consensus is that Miller was wrong. God, he was so wrong. The actual number is more like 5 plus or minus 1. Really, the limit on human mental bandwidth is between 4 and 6 independent entities, balls in the air that are unrelated at one time. Now, of course, the balls we're working on in our steps are somewhat related. So that number can go up from there. But what we're saying is that when I take a smaller step, I have fewer things in play. And because of that, I am more likely to be able to hold all those things in my head and manipulate them successfully mentally as I manipulate them successfully in the code. What about rhythm? Rhythm, computers don't care about rhythm in any way, shape, or form. The code doesn't care about rhythm in any way, shape, or form. So then, why do software development teams care so much about rhythm? Why do software development organizations want their people to have rhythm? Because the humans use rhythm very, very successfully and importantly. Periods of tension, periods of release. Alternating tension and release. That thing has actual biochemical impact in your head, right? It actually changes you when you go from tense to release, tension to release. Smaller steps gives us more and better rhythm. One of the things that we always do whenever we make a big release, like in those old school technique, we always have a great big party. We're so happy. Then we go back to work on Monday and start shipping the first hot fix. But that's neither here nor there. And the thing is, it's supposed to be this tremendous reward for us. It's supposed to make us high on life. Mostly what it does is make us high on alcohol, but that's neither here nor there. The bang from a big bang rhythm release is actually very short-lived, because your body doesn't actually care that much about how much reward it gets. It cares about whether the reward is distributed correctly on an as-needed basis. And rhythm is the thing that lets you do that. It is one of the most fundamental elements of motivation. I've written about that. You can talk to me sometime about ramps, where rhythm is actually one of the first and most important elements of human motivation. Smaller steps let us control rhythm. Finally, we have target parallelism. Do you work on a team whose customers have a single interest? Whose stakeholders, whose boss types are all interested in only one thing, the same thing? No, of course you don't, because nobody does. Because everybody in the room upstairs, the fancy room that you don't get to go to unless you're really, really in trouble or really, really good, they are all individuals with their own interests and their own pursuits and their own targets. One of the great myths of software development is the idea that you are only ever servicing one target. You are constantly servicing many targets. So how do smaller steps help with that? The granularity of the steps lets me say, I'm going to do this part from column A from that boss, and then I'm going to do this part from column B from that part boss. And it doesn't only just let me do that on it's the rules. It actually lets me smoothly adjust the gradient. If at some point or another it really does seem like the company is more interested in the column A target, I can put more column A work into the game. And vice versa, if it's column B. Or, remember steerability, if it's a whole new thing that had never occurred to us when we were planning our operation. So target parallelism becomes a very real thing in small steps. I can't do that if my step is enormous, because remember, I can't do anything else while I'm doing a step. I can only work on that step. So I just can't get there unless I fall back to directed parallelism. And we've already spent a whole bunch of time talking about how directed parallelism just isn't going to get us there. Whew, that was a really long time on one slide. Let's talk about changeability in TDD. Really, I'm not. What I'm really doing is I'm going after my fourth plank. I'm pointing out that rework avoidance processes are actually extremely expensive. And now I'm going to talk to you about the fact that actually changeability and our modern changeability practices are not terribly expensive. Specifically, let's start just with test-driven development. We're here at a test-driven development conference. TDD gives us automated consequence detection. What do I mean? What I mean is when I'm doing test-driven development, I'm writing a test that says, remember, it fails because it doesn't do that yet. Then I make a change and it passes because it does do that. The consequence of my change is actually detected. And it's not just detected, it's actually detected automatically. That is by running the program. Running the test kit. Furthermore, I don't just run the one test, I run all the tests. So not only is that true in terms of me being able to detect the consequence of my change for the new work, it's also true in terms of me being able to detect the consequence of my change for the old work. And that is actually of more value than the new, to be perfectly frank. Why? Because the worst bugs in the world are the ones you had no idea that you just shipped. The ones where you make your users experience sometimes astonishingly bad because it never occurred to you that the consequence of this tiny little change was actually going to be to completely destroy the application and bring down the entire continental power grid and the stock exchange at the same time. It simply never occurred to you. But automated consequence detection helps with that a lot. Next thing TDD does in terms of making it possible for us to do this is context switching support. Interruptibility means going from one context to another. Context switching is inherently somewhat expensive, but the tests that we have in test-driven development help us tightly narrow our focus. I don't want you to think about that other context you were just in. I just want you to think about this context right now. Furthermore, that context is mechanically described. That's the automation of our consequence detection. Context switching support is enormous for helping us manage these humongous products and projects that we work on. Finally, there's collaboration support. When I'm arguing with somebody about what the code does, blah, 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 I'm such a pain in the butt, right? And the other person's like, no, it takes that problem, it handles that problem, blah, 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 blah. The thing about the tests are they are executable documentation. They are proof. If I'm so convinced that the code won't handle X, well, I should write a test that fails because the code doesn't handle X. In fact, doing that is actually significantly faster than the 5 emails and the 2 meetings it takes for me to talk to somebody else about the problem. I can show up with the test. I can prove that it doesn't work, or I can be astonished and delighted that it does work, and I can add that test into our automated consequence detection. Rework avoidance, all the parallelism, the management, the control, the sit down. One day, Winnie the Pooh sat down and began to think. Think, 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 think. Rework avoidance theory is extremely expensive. We have learned an enormous amount about managing change in the last 20 years because we had to. And test-driven development is just one of the consequences of that learning how to deal with change. There's more changeability technique, right? And the world doesn't just revolve around TDD, even though I know this conference does. There's working by story. Stories also narrow our focus part of the way. They narrow it down to this is the next step. Next stepping is, of course, fundamental to what we're trying to do. Most stories, even in shops that are practicing agile, most stories are required to end in a green circle. They don't have to. That's one of the great myths. But it doesn't matter. Stories narrow the focus part way to next step. Pairing, mobbing, and the new word for mobbing is ensemble programming, which I approve of. I just used mobbing here because the slide's a little bit older. These two things maximize our collaboration and our knowledge sharing, which are critical to handling incoming changes. Remember, these things are so big, we don't have one person who knows everything about them anymore. It's not like the 80s. We have to have many people in the room, and they have to be collaborating well. So everything we learned about pairing and mobbing is that we actually increase the changeability of not just of our code, but of our whole process. Trunk-based development. Oh, Lord, please kill off those branches. Please, my friends, you've got to get rid of those branches. They are not helping you. They are hurting you. Trunk-based development, coupled with the pairing and mobbing, coupled with what we call pull and swarm, where we take one story and push it all the way through the system before we take on another story. All of this is optimizing our parallelism at minimum cost. Now, it's not free, but it is minimum. Why? When you saw all those arrows bouncing around, all those individual steps, hey, you know what? Every one of those was a shippable moment. Every one of them, there's no requirement that they all be done by the same person or the same team or anything. The only requirement is that each step is small enough and shippable at the end, that it's actually applied. If it's applied, we're good. We can do all of this and optimize our parallel process. Parallel targets, yes, but also parallel work streams, parallel people contributing to the product. As I say, there's no free lunch. Almost done here. There is no free lunch. I'm not proposing to you, if there are any boss types or CEOs in the room, I'm not proposing that this costs you nothing. It does cost you something. You have to do some unlearning and you have to do some new learning. The biggest single thing you have to unlearn is this idea of pre-commitment, where you commit to the finality of a target. If you can let go of that, you'll probably be able to find the other two pieces of this. And the other two pieces of the unlearning are letting go of hierarchical command and control. You do not need a central intelligence directing your parallel process. You need granularity that is small enough that you don't have to solve every problem in your head before you solve it in real life. That's what you need. And then finally, additive production reasoning, which is all that whole rework avoidance concept where every step takes the surface of the product one unit of stepdom further. We can add them all up. We can roll them up in Jira. We can see the status of every line of code. Letting go of that. Unlearning that stuff is not easy because we all came up, especially the older folks, we all came up in a model in which pre-commitment, hierarchical command and control, and additive production reasoning were fundamental to our model. But you got to unlearn them. Meanwhile, there's stuff you got to learn. Test-driven development itself. I started learning test-driven development about 22 years ago. And I would say it took me about 2 years to get to the place where I was sure where I was pretty confident I knew what I didn't understand. Then it took me about 2 more years of practice to come up with tentative solutions to those problems I didn't understand. And then it took me about 2 more years of practice to get to a place where I don't have any automated answers to these problems anymore. I'm able to actually look at each puzzle independently. I don't give rules. I don't use never, always in my test-driven development lessons or in my test-driven development work. Instead, I rely on my judgment. I fly by the seat of my pants. And remember that the seat of my pants, my judgment has come from making many, many mistakes over a long period of time. Now, it wasn't all red bars. There were wins, big wins along that way. But you got to learn test-driven development. It isn't as simple as red, green, refactor. Nothing in life is as simple as that until you get extraordinarily good at it. Next thing you got to learn, path-focused design. Path-focused design is this business of making sure that every step is actually shippable. It means changing yourself away from this model of the finished part and towards this model of I need to ship this even if it's not finished. Path-focused design is about attending to the idea that I've shown you in that effective change path that I showed you before. Finally, you got to learn how to collaborate. The best collaboration that we have comes at this point from mobbing, from pairing, and from swarming. Swarming is, we're not in a mob, but we're all working on the same problem at a different time. I mean, at the same time, just gathered around a table on our individual machines. That's what swarming really is. Mobbing, pairing, and swarming are hard. They're not natural skills, and they're especially not natural skills in a trade dominated by the belief that knowing syntax is at the heart of programming. And unfortunately, our trade is dominated by that belief. So we got a whole lot of people who think that there's a technical solution to every problem, who think that it would be best if we all sat in darkened rooms and worked quietly by ourselves to spin out brilliant thoughts. And, that's not insane. It comes from our history. Because in 1980, that was actually a pretty damn good way to write programs. It's just not a good way to write programs anymore. So that means that we have to learn collaboration. We have to learn how to pair well. We have to learn how to mob well. We have to learn how to swarm well. These things were not taught to us. And most of us did not, grow up in a way that we could understand how to apply our relationships that we have in our households and our families, our successful, happy relationships, to our work life. But now we have to do that. So we're just about done here. Throw everything you got at a walking skeleton to get to a walking skeleton as soon as possible. That's only true if you're in Greenfield. The rest of the time, we're in Legacy. We already got ourselves a walking skeleton. Adopt the 3 criteria. Each step must fit. Each step must be shippable, must be put into the field. Each step must not make the user's experience worse. Third, use multiple teams or multiple individuals adding steps to approach the minimum viable product. And fourth, keep going that way. This is the route to effective change. And it's actually represented right there in test-driven development. But I said at the beginning that we were going to talk about more than test-driven development. This is the route to effective change in your code. It's the route to effective change in your person. It's the route to effective change in your process, in your teams, in your organization. It is the route to effective change everywhere, which is a central part of my thing. And it is the thing that I learned by learning test-driven development, or starting to learn it. I'm still learning it all those years ago. So I know that I'm sitting here with a room full of people who are actually technicians, but I'm going to ask you this closing question, which is just this. What do you want to change? You don't have to just change code. Look around you. Look around you outside. Look at the world. We can change the world using exactly these ideas. If you want more value faster, if you want more successful change, if you want more money, if you want any of those things, my rice and garlic advice to you is take many more, much smaller steps. Thank you very much. And thank you, Alex, and the other organizers for helping me and for getting me all set up. And I am good to go, I think.